You remember the grease tin on the back of the stove? Every kitchen had one. Every mother guarded it like it held gold because during the war it did. 12 ration stamps for the month. Sugar, butter, meat, coffee, everything a kitchen depended on. Measured out by Washington and never quite enough. For black families already stretching pennies under Jim Crow, rationing did not introduce scarcity. It deepened it. But something came out of those kitchens that no government office anticipated. Meals that cost almost nothing. Meals that kept children strong and tables full when the stamps ran out by the third week. Number 7 on this list was made from a part of the hog most people refused to touch. And number 14 turned something the butcher threw in the gutter into a stew that kept whole families going for days. These were not Depression leftovers. These were wartime inventions, born in kitchens where failure meant hungry children. Hit subscribe because this kind of history does not get told nearly enough. Here are 25 wartime meals black mothers invented when rationing hit hardest. Number 25, tomato gravy on rice. When the garden came in with more tomatoes than anyone could eat fresh and the canning jars were running low, black mothers crushed ripe tomatoes into a skillet with drippings, added a spoonful of flour, and stirred until the mixture thickened into a smooth, brick-red gravy. Poured over a plate of white rice, it became a full meal from a tomato, some fat, and a handful of grain. The gravy tasted like summer, even in the middle of winter, when the tomatoes came from jars put up the August before. Salt, black pepper, and the slow caramelization of the fruit in hot fat gave it a sweetness that had nothing to do with sugar. Some mothers added a strip of bacon if there was one to spare. Most did not bother. The tomatoes carried the dish on their own. During rationing, a plate of tomato gravy on rice cost less than anything else on the table and filled the stomach just as well. Number 24, vinegar pie. When lemons were unavailable and sugar was rationed by the ounce, black mothers in the rural South made pie filling from what the pantry always had. Apple cider vinegar, a little flour, an egg, and enough molasses or sorghum to take the edge off the acid. Mixed together and poured into a simple crust made from flour and drippings. It baked into a custard that trembled when it cooled. The taste was sharp and sweet at once, closer to chess pie than anything made with fruit. Nobody who ate it for the first time believed the ingredient list. Vinegar had no business being dessert, and yet the women who baked it made it work the way they made everything work, by refusing to accept that the cupboard was too bare to produce something sweet. One pie, one egg, a splash from the bottle that cost almost nothing. It fed the whole table after supper. Number 23, mock apple pie. When fruit became scarce and sugar was rationed down to the ounce, black mothers in the South found a workaround that still confuses people who hear about it for the first time. Soda crackers, broken into pieces, layered in a pie dish with cinnamon, a splash of vinegar, and whatever sweetener could be spared. The crackers softened in the oven and took on a texture that somehow passed for stewed apples. The vinegar gave it tartness. The cinnamon did the rest. It was not an apple pie, nobody pretended it was, but it sat on the table where an apple pie would have sat, and it solved the same problem, something sweet at the end of a meal that cost almost nothing to make. Ritz later printed a version on the back of their box and acted like they thought of it. They did not. Number 22, drippings biscuits. Every spoonful of bacon grease, every scraping of rendered fat from a roast or a pan of fried chicken went into a tin can on the back of the stove. That can was currency. When butter was rationed and lard was hard to find, that saved grease became the fat in every batch of biscuits. The dough came together fast. Flour, a pinch of baking powder, a little milk or water, and a generous spoon of drippings worked in with the fingers until it held together. Those biscuits came out of the oven, heavy and golden, with a flavor that store-bought butter never matched. Nothing was wasted. Nothing could be. The war made sure of that. Number 21, leather breeches. In late summer, black mothers strung green beans on heavy thread and hung them from porch rafters and kitchen ceilings to dry in the heat. The beans shriveled and curled until they looked like strips of old leather, and the name stuck. Hung properly, they kept for months without canning, without salt, without any preservation besides air. When winter came and the garden was bare, those dried beans came down from the ceiling and went into a pot of water with a piece of smoked meat. They simmered for hours, rehydrating slowly, absorbing the smoke and salt from the pork until they turned tender with a concentrated flavor that fresh beans could not match. The texture was different, denser, chewier. Each bean tasted like it remembered the summer it grew in. Leather breeches needed no ration stamps, no store, and no icebox. Just a porch, some thread, and the patience to let the sun do the work. Number 20, molasses bread. Refined white sugar was one of the first things rationed. Molasses was not. Black mothers who had been cooking with blackstrap molasses for generations barely noticed the switch. The rest of the country was learning to make do. These women already knew. Molasses bread used cornmeal or rough wheat flour, a heavy pour of blackstrap, a little baking soda, and water. It baked into something dark and dense with a bittersweet chew that children either loved or learned to love because there was nothing else. Nobody measured the nutritional content at the time. They measured it by whether the children stopped complaining about being hungry. That was the only metric that mattered in a wartime kitchen. What made these kitchens different was not just the food, it was the math. White families, during rationing, received the same stamp books, stood in the same lines, dealt with the same shortages, but they started from a different place. Black families in the South earned a fraction of what white families earned. They had less to begin with, fewer stores that would serve them, and ration boards in many counties that gave them the runaround or shorted their allotments. The Office of Price Administration was supposed to be fair. In practice, it ran on local boards, and local boards ran on local power. What that meant for a black mother in rural Alabama or Mississippi was simple. The stamps she received bought less. The stores she could use charged more. And the meals she put on that table had to stretch further than anything the government ever planned for. That was not a cooking problem. That was an engineering problem. Number 19, crackling bread. After rendering lard from hog fat, the crisp brown bits left behind at the bottom of the pot were cracklings. Black mothers saved every one of them. Crumbled into a batch of cornbread batter, they added richness and crunch that no amount of butter could replicate. Crackling bread came out of the oven heavier than regular cornbread, studded with little pockets of rendered pork that burst with flavor when you bit into them. It was bread and meat in the same bite. During the war, when the lard was needed for cooking and the meat was rationed, those cracklings represented the last measure of value squeezed from a single piece of fat. Nothing left behind, nothing wasted. The fat went into the biscuits, the cracklings went into the bread. The cycle of use was so complete that a single hog killing echoed through the kitchen for weeks. Number 18, neck bone stew. Smoked neck bones sat in a cheap bin at the butcher counter because there was barely enough meat on them to justify the effort. Black mothers saw something else. They bought them by the pound, brought them home, and simmered them in a heavy pot with onion, celery, potatoes, and whatever root vegetables the garden offered. The bones gave up their collagen slowly, turning the broth thick and silky, while the small pieces of meat clinging to the vertebrae grew tender enough to fall away at the touch of a spoon. The marrow melted into the liquid and enriched everything it touched. A pot of neck bone stew started in the morning, fed a family through supper, and left enough for the next day. The bones cost so little that some butchers practically gave them away. The stew they produced tasted like it had no right to be that good for what it cost. That gap between price and flavor was where Black mothers did their best work. Number 17, bean cake patties. Dry beans were cheap, available, and not subject to the same rationing pressure as meat. Black mothers soaked them overnight, cooked them down, then mashed them with a fork or a potato masher until the mixture could be shaped. Onion went in, salt and pepper, sometimes a little cornmeal to hold the patty together. Fried in a hot skillet with drippings, they came out crisp on the outside and soft in the middle, with enough protein to replace the pork chop that was not coming home from the store this week. Some families called them poor man's cutlets. Some just called them supper. The children did not know they were eating a substitute. They just knew the plate was full and the patties tasted like someone had taken the time to season them right. Number 16, poke salad. Pokeweed grew wild along fences, roadsides, and the edges of fields across the South. It cost nothing. It belonged to nobody and everybody. Black mothers picked the young leaves in spring before the plant grew tall and tough, boiled them in 2 or 3 changes of water to remove the bitterness and the compounds that made the mature plant dangerous, then fried the boiled greens in a skillet with drippings, onion, and a scrambled egg if there was one to spare. Poke salad was not a salad. It was a cooked green, rich in vitamins, with a flavor somewhere between spinach and something wilder. During rationing, when store-bought greens carried a price and a trip into town, pokeweed grew 20 feet from the back door. The women who picked it taught their children which leaves to take and which to leave alone. Number 15, canned salmon croquettes. Canned salmon was one of the few protein sources that stayed on shelves throughout the war. It was not rationed the way fresh meat was, and it was cheap enough that a single can could anchor a meal for a whole family. Black mothers opened the can, drained it, picked out the bones, and mixed the fish with a beaten egg, cornmeal or crushed crackers, onion, salt, and pepper. Shaped into patties and fried in drippings until golden on both sides, salmon croquettes came to the table crisp and hot with enough substance to replace the pork or chicken that the ration book would not allow this week. Some served them with white gravy. Some served them plain alongside rice. Either way, the can was empty and the table was full. That was the only math these kitchens ran on. Number 14, chicken foot stew. The feet were free. Butchers trimmed them off and tossed them aside or sold them for so little that the price barely registered. Black mothers collected them by the bagful, brought them home, and began the work that no one talks about when they talk about soul food. The scales had to be peeled off after a quick dip in boiling water. The nails had to be clipped. Each foot had to be scrubbed and cleaned until it looked like something that belonged in a pot rather than a trash bin. Then they went into water with onion, salt, pepper, and whatever root vegetable was on hand, and they simmered for hours. What happened next was chemistry. The collagen in those joints and tendons broke down slowly, turning the broth thick and golden, with a body that no boneless cut of meat could ever produce. The feet themselves softened until the tiny bones could be pulled out, leaving behind pieces of tender, gelatinous meat that melted on the tongue. Some mothers added cornmeal dumplings to the pot. Some served the stew over rice and let the broth soak into the grain. Some just ladled it into bowls and let the bread do the rest. A bag of chicken feet during the war could produce enough stew to feed a family for 2 full days, with broth left over to start the next pot of greens or beans. The butcher considered them garbage. The women who carried them home in paper sacks knew better. They knew that anything with a joint and a bone had something to give if you were patient enough to coax it out. That patience was the secret ingredient in every wartime kitchen. Not the seasoning, not the technique, the willingness to stand over a pot for 4 hours and wait for something that the rest of the world had thrown away to become something worth sitting down for. Chicken foot stew was the dish that proved it. There is a piece of this story that rarely gets told. Black mothers during the war were not just feeding their own families. Many of them worked as cooks and housekeepers in white households, preparing meals from well-stocked pantries all day, then going home to kitchens where the ration stamps had already run out. They cooked 2 meals every day of the war, one for someone else's family with someone else's butter, and one for their own with whatever they could find. The ingenuity on this list did not come from leisure. It came from women who had already spent 8 or 10 hours on their feet in another woman's kitchen, who walked home in the dark, and who still put something hot on the table before their children went to bed. That context matters. These were not hobby recipes. These were acts of endurance dressed up as supper. Number 13, Potlikker soup. Every pot of greens left behind a broth. Dark, rich, loaded with nutrients that had leached from the leaves during hours of slow cooking. Most families drank it on the side or sopped it up with cornbread. But during rationing, when greens might be the only substantial food in the house, Black mothers turned that broth into a meal of its own. Potlikker was reheated with a piece of cornbread crumbled into it, or served in a bowl with a boiled egg dropped in if there was one. The broth from collards or turnip greens carried the flavor of whatever smoked meat had seasoned the pot, even if the meat itself had already been eaten. It was a meal made from the ghost of a meal. The flavor was real. The nourishment was real. The only thing missing was the ingredient that had already been served the night before. Number 12, pickled watermelon rind. After the red flesh was eaten, the thick white rind remained, and in a wartime kitchen, throwing it away was not an option. Black mothers peeled the green skin off, cut the white rind into pieces, and simmered them in a syrup of vinegar, molasses, cinnamon, and cloves until they turned translucent and tender. Packed into jars, pickled watermelon rind lasted months on the shelf and served as a side dish, a snack, and a sweet-sour condiment alongside beans and rice. A single large watermelon produced enough rind to fill several jars. The fruit was summer, the pickled rind was winter. Black mothers who kept those jars in the pantry knew that preserving was not a hobby, it was a calendar. Each jar represented a meal in a month when the garden would be empty and the ration book would be thin. Number 11, rabbit and dumplings. Rabbit ran wild across every field and woodlot in the rural South, and the men who set box traps or hunted with dogs brought home meat that no ration board controlled. Black mothers cleaned the rabbit, cut it into pieces, and browned it in a hot skillet before transferring it to a pot of water with onion, salt, and pepper. While the rabbit simmered and the meat started to loosen from the bone, they mixed flour, a pinch of baking powder, and a little water into a stiff dough, pinched off small pieces, and dropped them into the bubbling broth. The dumplings cooked in the steam and the rabbit stock, puffing up soft on top while the bottoms turned dense and slick with broth. Rabbit meat was lean and mild, and the dumplings stretched it into a meal that could fill every bowl at the table. One rabbit, one pot, a handful of flour, a complete supper that owed nothing to the store or the ration book. Number 10, smothered cabbage with salt meat. Cabbage was one of the cheapest vegetables in any store, and it grew easily in a backyard garden without much attention. Black mothers quartered a head of cabbage, laid it in a heavy pot with a piece of salt pork or fatback, added water, and covered the pot. It cooked low and slow until the cabbage turned silky and translucent, soaking up the salt and smoke from the meat. The liquid in the bottom of the pot became a broth worth drinking on its own. One head of cabbage and a small piece of salt meat fed a family of 5 with leftovers for the next morning. It was simple, it was filling, and it was entirely within reach, even when every ration stamp in the book was already spent. Number 9, sweet potato pone. Sweet potatoes were the most reliable crop in a wartime garden. They grew in poor soil, produced heavily, and stored through winter in a root cellar without canning or refrigeration. Black mothers grated raw sweet potatoes, mixed them with molasses, a little ginger, and whatever fat the kitchen held, and baked the mixture in a heavy pan until the top caramelized, dark, and the center set into something dense and chewy. Sweet potato pone was not a pie and not a cake. It sat somewhere between the two, sweet enough to end a meal, but sturdy enough to start one. Children ate it cold from the pan the next morning before school. The molasses gave it depth. The ginger gave it bite. The sweet potato gave it everything else. No sugar required, no eggs if there were none, just the tuber, the syrup, and the oven. Number 8, commodity cheese grits. The United States government distributed surplus commodity cheese to low-income families during and after the war. It came in long blocks, dense and orange, with a processed texture that melted smoothly and a salt content that meant a little went a long way. Black mothers in the South dropped chunks of it into a pot of hot grits and stirred until the cheese disappeared into the porridge, turning it creamy and rich. Commodity cheese grits became a breakfast, a lunch, and sometimes a supper, depending on what else was in the house. The cheese was free, the grits were cheap. The combination was filling enough to send a child to school with a full stomach and keep them going until the afternoon. No one was proud of government cheese, but no one let it go to waste either. Number 7, chitlins. White butchers cleaned out the hog intestines, rinsed them, and sold them for pennies to anyone willing to take the trouble. Black mothers took the trouble. They carried those intestines home in buckets, soaked them overnight in salt water, and spent the better part of a morning scrubbing each section by hand until the kitchen smelled like something no visitor ever forgot. That smell announced itself through walls and across yards. Neighbors knew what day it was. Cleaning chitlins demanded patience that bordered on devotion because the family needed protein, and this was what the butcher let go for almost nothing. After hours of preparation, the cleaned intestines went into a pot with vinegar, onions, salt, pepper, and a scattering of hot pepper flakes. They simmered low and slow until they turned tender and rich. People who grew up on chitlins did not love them despite their origins. They loved them because of what those origins proved. A bucket of offal, the parts deemed worthless by everyone with options, became a dish worth gathering around. Wartime rationing pushed better cuts beyond reach, and chitlins filled the gap without apology. A single pot started on Saturday morning, stretched through Sunday supper and into Monday lunch. Church halls served them alongside cornbread and greens. Family reunions built whole tables around them. What began as pure necessity turned, across decades, into fierce tradition. Today, chitlins split families down generational lines. Grandchildren pushed the plate away. Aunts refused to set a holiday table without them. But the women who stood at those sinks during the war years, scrubbing intestine after intestine with raw hands, never had the luxury of preference. They had hungry children and a bag of what nobody else wanted. They made it into something worth remembering. The ration system was supposed to create fairness, equal stamps, equal access, equal sacrifice for the war effort. But fairness assumes equal starting points, And nothing about the 1940s South started equal. A black mother with a ration book walked into a store where she might be served last, charged more, or told to come back later. She grew food in a garden on rented land. She cooked on a stove she might not own in a house she almost certainly did not. Every meal on this list was made under those conditions, not just rationing on top of everything else. And still, those tables were set every night. Still, those children were fed. The food was not the miracle, the women were. Number 6, blackstrap molasses, gingerbread. When refined sugar was rationed, blackstrap molasses became the sweetener of choice in black kitchens that had been using it for generations anyway. Gingerbread, made with molasses instead of sugar, was darker, denser, and had a bittersweet depth that white sugar could never match. Cornmeal, or whatever flour was available, went in with baking soda, ginger, a little cinnamon, and sometimes a splash of buttermilk. It baked into a thick, dark square that was cake and bread at the same time. Cut into pieces and served warm, it satisfied the craving for something sweet without using a single ration stamp on sugar. Children who grew up eating molasses, gingerbread during the war kept asking for it long after sugar came back to the shelves. The taste outlived the shortage. Number 5, cornbread and clabber. Clabber was raw milk left to sour and thicken naturally at room temperature, something that happened on its own in the kitchen without refrigeration. It was not spoiled, it was fermented, thick as yogurt, tangy, and perfectly safe to eat. Black mothers crumbled leftover cornbread into a glass or a bowl and poured clabber over it. That was a meal, breakfast usually, or a late night supper after the real cooking was done. It required nothing from the store. The milk came from a neighbor's cow or the family's own. The cornbread was already made. The combination delivered calcium, protein, and enough calories to start or end the day. When the war made everything else complicated, cornbread and clabber remained simple. It was a meal that existed entirely outside the ration economy. Number 4, creek fish fried in cornmeal. Fresh meat was rationed, fish from the creek was not. Black families across the rural South lived near water, and the men and boys who fished those creeks and ponds brought home catfish, bream, and perch that never passed through a store or a ration board. The mothers cleaned them, rolled them in seasoned cornmeal, and fried them whole in a hot skillet with drippings. The cornmeal crust turned crisp and golden. The flesh inside stayed moist and flaky. Served with whatever greens were on hand and a piece of cornbread, creek fish became a wartime staple that cost nothing but time and a cane pole. The fishing was the easy part. The cleaning was the work, but a good afternoon at the creek could feed a family for 2 nights running, and the bones went into a pot to make stock for the next day's soup. Number 3, muscadine preserves on biscuits. Muscadine grapes grew wild on thick vines in the woods and along the tree lines of the South. They were tough-skinned, deeply sweet, and free to anyone who knew where the vines were. Black mothers gathered them by the bucket in late summer and cooked them down with whatever sweetener was available, usually sorghum or a careful ration of sugar, into a thick preserve that lasted through winter in sealed jars. Spread on a hot biscuit, muscadine preserves turned bread and fruit into a breakfast that tasted like abundance, even when the rest of the pantry was bare. The vines produced year after year without planting, pruning, or attention. The war could ration sugar, it could ration butter, it could not ration what grew wild in the woods behind the house. Number 2, pig ear sandwich. The ears were boiled for hours until the cartilage turned soft and the tough skin became tender enough to slice. Black mothers cooked them with vinegar, bay leaf, and hot pepper, then chilled the cooked ears until they firmed up enough to be cut thin. Laid between 2 pieces of cornbread with hot sauce and a sliced onion. A pig ear sandwich was a meal that cost almost nothing and delivered a texture unlike anything else on the plate. The outside had a slight chew. The inside was soft and gelatinous where the cartilage had broken down. The vinegar kept it sharp and clean, cutting through the richness of the rendered fat. During rationing, ears, along with every other part of the hog that the higher price cuts left behind, became the foundation of meals that fed families for days. The butcher called them scraps. The women who bought them called them supper. Number 1, the Sunday pot. This final entry has no single recipe because the practice itself outweighs any ingredient list. A cast iron pot sat on the back of the stove every Sunday morning, and whatever a woman could grow, trade for, borrow from a neighbor, or pull from the last jar in the pantry went into it. The pot simmered while the family walked to church. It waited through the sermon and the long conversation on the steps afterward. On Monday, she reheated what remained, added water, dropped in a handful of dried beans or a leftover biscuit to thicken it. On Tuesday, she did the same. By Wednesday, the pot was scraped clean, and by Thursday, she was already thinking about what Sunday would bring. The women who kept that cycle turning through the war years never used the word invention. They called it Tuesday. They called it making do. They stretched a single chicken carcass across 4 days of meals for 6 people without once repeating the same flavor twice because they seasoned by instinct and adjusted by smell, and they never wrote a word of it down. Every meal on this list traces back to a woman standing over heat, deciding what her family would eat when the answer should have been nothing. Rationing, poverty, a country that compensated their labor with contempt. None of it stopped the pot from going on the stove. None of it kept a plate from being set in front of every child at the table. That is what these 25 meals share. Not a cuisine, not a cookbook tradition, a refusal to let circumstance dictate whether the people you love eat well tonight. Before anyone used the phrase thermal curtain, Black grandmothers in the 1960s had already invented the concept with whatever heavy fabric came to hand. Wool blankets tacked above the window frame and let hang to the floor. Velvet curtains doubled over to trap a pocket of still air against the glass. Old coats draped across exterior windowsills when the cold settled in hard. The principle was sound. Moving air carries heat away from a surface fast, and still air trapped in folds of heavy fabric insulates against that transfer. A single layer of curtain fabric against a drafty window could reduce heat loss through that pane by 30%, and a double layer did better still. What your grandmother hung in those windows was not decoration. It was calculation, an understanding of cold and cloth and the way heat behaves when you give it nowhere to escape. She couldn't tell you the R value of a wool blanket, but she could tell you which window needed 2 layers and which could get by with 1, just by the way the candle flame moved when you held it close. Pig feet stew was hearty winter fare that transformed an overlooked cut into something families craved when temperatures dropped. The feet were split, cleaned thoroughly, and simmered for hours until the skin became tender and natural gelatin thickened the broth into something luxurious. Onions, garlic, vinegar, and crushed red pepper created a tangy heat that cut through the richness. Some families added potatoes or beans to stretch the meal. The stew was made in large batches because it kept well and improved after sitting overnight in the refrigerator. The gelatin would set into a jiggly mass that liquefied again when reheated. This dish required patience. Rushing meant tough, chewy results. Children watched mothers and grandmothers tend these pots, learning that good food took time. Pig feet stew proved nothing went to waste. Hardtack soaked in coffee was a battlefield breakfast Black soldiers learned to appreciate during overseas deployment when a fresh food was impossible. The hard, dry biscuits were nearly inedible alone, but soaking them in hot coffee softened them enough to chew while adding bitterness that made them palatable. This was survival food, yet Black troops found ways to make it work by dunking hardtack until it became something approaching breakfast. The coffee was often weak, stretched to serve many men, but its warmth provided psychological comfort in cold trenches. Soldiers shared techniques for softening hardtack, passing knowledge along just as families passed down recipes at home. This breakfast represented adaptation and resilience, turning military necessity into sustenance that kept men going. The cast iron stove was never just for cooking, and every Black grandmother in the 1960s understood this without having to say so. You started a pot of beans in the morning, not only because the family needed to eat, but because the stove needed to be burning. And a burning stove meant a warm kitchen, and a warm kitchen meant the whole back half of the house climbed a few degrees by noon. Women managing households on tight budgets in cities like Detroit and Cleveland had worked out a thermal logic no engineering firm had put on paper. Cook hot all day, keep the burners low but constant. Never let the stove go cold until everyone was in bed. Cast iron held heat long after the flame dropped. Turn the burner off at 9 and it was still radiating at midnight. What's been lost is not the knowledge exactly. It's the understanding that the stove was doing two jobs at once. She knew. She just never explained it because you were supposed to pick it up by being present. Black-eyed pea stew carried cultural significance beyond. Its role as winter fare, it was luck food, traditionally eaten on New Year's Day, but enjoyed through cold months. The peas were simmered with smoked meat, usually ham hocks or salt pork, until they became creamy and the broth turned rich with smoky depth. Onions, garlic, and tomatoes joined the pot, adding layers of flavor that made each spoonful interesting. Some cooks added collard greens directly to the stew, creating a complete meal that symbolized prosperity. The peas provided protein and fiber, while smoked meat added fat and flavor that satisfied deep hunger. Children ate this stew, knowing the stories behind it, that peas represented coins and greens represented paper money. This was tradition passed down through generations, connecting families to heritage through every bowl. Fried fatback with scrambled eggs was a breakfast that stretched limited resources while delivering maximum energy for Black soldiers in training camps. Fatback was sliced and fried until crispy outside while staying tender within, releasing rendered fat used to cook the eggs. The eggs were scrambled in that flavorful fat, picking up smoky, salty richness that made each bite memorable. This was economical cooking at its finest, turning inexpensive ingredients into something substantial and satisfying. For soldiers who grew up during the Depression, this breakfast represented survival wisdom passed through generations. The combination of protein and calories provided sustained energy for physical demands. Black cooks in segregated mess halls made this dish with care, knowing it carried both nourishment and the comfort of home. Rolling old towels and worn-out coats into a tight cylinder and pressing them against the bottom of the front door was so common in 1960s Black households that you almost didn't notice it anymore. It was just there, the way the rug was there or the coat hooks were there. A 1/4-inch gap under an exterior door in a Chicago winter could drop a room's temperature by 10 degrees overnight, and most of the row houses and tenements that Black seniors occupied had gaps like that because nobody was coming to fix them, and landlords in red-line neighborhoods counted on tenants not knowing their options. The draft snake was stationed at every door leading to the outside or to an unheated room. When the wind picked up, you could feel it pressing against the cloth from the other side. The coat you rolled up was always the one too warm to wear out anymore, so it kept working. Ham hock and bean stew was a wintertime miracle that transformed dried beans and smoked pork into a meal substantial enough to fuel a family through freezing temperatures. The ham hocks were simmered for hours, their smoky essence infusing the cooking liquid while collagen broke down into silky richness. Navy beans or Great Northerns were added, absorbing every bit of porky flavor as they softened into creamy tenderness. Onions, garlic, and bay leaves rounded out the pot. This stew was Monday food in many households, made when the weekend ham bone still had meat clinging to it. The beans provided protein that rivaled expensive cuts, and the broth was considered medicine for cold and flu season. Families stretched this stew across several days, knowing each reheating only deepened the flavors. Rice and tomato gravy was a breakfast reflecting gula geechee and low country traditions many black soldiers carried into military service. The gravy was made from canned tomatoes simmered with onions, seasoned and thickened until it clung to each grain of rice. This dish was affordable and practical for mess hall cooking while still tasting like home. For soldiers from South Carolina, Georgia, and coastal regions, rice was a staple that sustained their communities for generations. The tomato gravy added brightness that cut through starchiness, creating balanced breakfast that satisfied without heaviness. Black cooks understood cultural significance, preparing it with same attention their mothers and grandmothers showed. It was heritage served on metal trays in military cafeterias. The plastic sheeting kit was not glamorous. It came in a roll you could buy at the hardware store for under $1. You cut it to size and tacked it against the window frame with strips of cardboard or straight pins, pulling it taut enough to create a sealed layer of still air between the plastic and the glass. That thin layer functioned like a second pane. Cold couldn't conduct through still air the way it conducted through glass, and the result was a window that let in the same light, but stopped a measurable share of the heat loss. The Philadelphia Tribune documented this as a common fixture in black households throughout the 1960s, noting window kits were among the most widely used insulation methods in redline neighborhoods where landlords had no legal obligation to maintain adequate heating. The plastic fogged and yellowed by February. You replaced it in October. It was the closest thing to a storm window most of these families ever had. Nobody told you to do it. You just noticed one day that the floor felt warmer in the bedroom than it used to. And when you asked, she lifted the corner of the mattress and showed you. Turkey wing stew appeared on tables in winter, especially after holidays when turkey parts went on sale. The wings were large enough to provide substantial meat while remaining affordable for families watching every dollar. They were browned in a heavy pot until the skin crisped, then covered with water and simmered with onions, celery, carrots, and potatoes. The dark meat stayed moist through long cooking, becoming tender enough to fall from the bone. Bay, leaves, and thyme added depth without cost, and some cooks stirred in tomato paste for color. This stew fed families for days, the broth growing more flavorful with each reheating. Children loved pulling the meat from bones themselves, making dinner feel interactive. Turkey wing stew represented smart shopping and smarter cooking, turning sale items into meals that felt abundant. Blackstrap molasses stirred into warm milk was a morning drink, providing iron and energy for black soldiers facing demanding days of training. The molasses, dark and thick with slightly bitter edge, was spooned into heated milk and stirred until liquid turned deep brown. This drink was nutritious and economical, offering essential minerals that helped to maintain strength when fresh food was scarce. Many soldiers had grown up drinking this at home, where molasses was cheaper than sugar and provided benefits. Mothers understood instinctively. The warmth and distinctive flavor brought comfort during early mornings in unfamiliar barracks far from home. For Black troops facing discrimination while serving their country, small comforts helped maintain morale. It was sustenance carrying heritage in every sip. After the biscuits came out, after whatever had spent an hour in the oven finished the baking, the door stayed cracked, not wide open, just a few inches, and the residual heat bled slowly into the kitchen for close to an hour afterward. This was deliberate. On cold mornings, when the kitchen was where everyone gathered before the rest of the house came up to temperature, the oven was the fastest heat source available, and a woman who had managed a cold house for 30 winters knew exactly how to use it. Homestead writers, going back generations, documented baking as a dual-purpose operation, feeding the family and warming the house at the same time. You didn't leave the oven on unattended. That was dangerous, and she knew that too. But the door cracked, the warm air rising in slow waves you could feel on your face if you stood close. That was free, and she never wasted free. Chicken foot stew might raise eyebrows today, but in Black kitchens of the 1970s, it was beloved comfort food made from parts others threw away. The feet were scrubbed clean, blanched to remove the outer skin, then simmered until they released natural gelatin into the broth. This created body and richness that regular chicken pieces could not achieve. Potatoes, carrots, and onions joined the pot, soaking up that deeply savory liquid. Some cooks added hot peppers for warmth that went beyond temperature. The stew was valued during winter illnesses when families believed its collagen-rich broth could heal what ailed you. Children sometimes balked at the appearance, but one taste usually converted them. The feet were free or nearly so, making this stew an act of pure kitchen wisdom, taking what was dismissed and creating nourishment. Powdered egg scrambles became a reality of military breakfast that Black soldiers learned to transform through creativity. The dehydrated eggs required water to reconstitute, producing rubbery texture and flat flavor compared to fresh eggs. But Black cooks in segregated mess halls improved these scrambles by adding rendered fat, onions when available, and generous seasoning that masked artificial taste. The eggs were cooked slowly, stirred constantly for best texture from difficult ingredients. For soldiers who remember mother's fluffy scrambles from fresh eggs, these military versions were poor substitute, yet still provided essential protein. The creativity applied to improving powdered eggs reflected broader resilience of Black communities, turning inadequate resources into something that could sustain. Sleeping 3 or 4 to a bed wasn't a hardship your grandmother talked about. It was just the arrangement, natural in the cold months, never questioned. Children piled in with their siblings and sometimes with a grandmother or aunt, not because there weren't enough beds, but because the heat 2 small bodies generated under a pile of quilts was more reliable than anything a landlord provided. A person at rest produces roughly the same warmth as a 60-watt bulb, and under 3 layers of quilts, that heat goes nowhere. The children who slept in the middle were always the warmest. The one on the outside edge near the wall was the one who woke at 3 and pulled the quilt tighter without waking anyone else. You learned to sleep still so you didn't let the cold air in. Years later, sleeping alone felt like something was missing. Not a person exactly, but the warmth of not being the only heat source in the room. Neck bone stew carried families through the coldest months when money was tight and bellies needed filling. Pork neck bones were cheap at the butcher counter, often sold for pennies a pound because most people overlooked them. But black cooks knew better. They understood these bony cuts held deep flavor waiting to be coaxed out through gentle simmering. The bones were browned first, then covered with water and left to bubble alongside potatoes, carrots, onions, and celery until the meat became fork tender. Some families added turnips or cabbage to stretch things further. The smell alone announced dinner was ready, drifting through every room like a warm invitation. Children hovered near the stove, waiting to tear meat from bones with their fingers. This stew proved the humblest ingredients could become something worth gathering around. Those are 25 wartime meals Black mothers invented when rationing hit hardest. 25 reasons why soul food is not a trend, not a brand, and not a restaurant menu. It is a record of survival passed down through hands, not pages. Try one this week. Make the tomato gravy, simmer the chicken feet, fry the creek fish in cornmeal, and see what those kitchens tasted like. Drop the name of the dish your mother or grandmother made that never once appeared in a cookbook. That record matters more than any ration book ever printed.